The wind that swept through Santo Dedo felt like the breath of two eras colliding. It came hot and uneasy, carrying the sharp tang of iron filings from freshly laid railroad ties and the deep, ancient scent of Arizona's red soil. It scraped along the rough plank walls of false front buildings, rattled the saloon windows, and dragged the stink of cattle fat, sweat, and cheap whiskey down the town's lone, rutted street. It was 1879. Santo Dedo sat stretched tight as an exposed nerve between the jagged rise of the Mogollon Rim and the dark mouth of Cañon del Lobo. Hidden within that canyon, far from most eyes, lay a sacred spring, the lifeblood of the people of Stone Wind Camp, who still claimed this unforgiving land as home. Late that afternoon, with the sun striking the earth like a hammer on an anvil, Riven rode his Pinto into town. He was in his early 30s, lean and weather-hardened, moving with the quiet precision of a hunter. His eyes were calm but watchful, eyes that had seen too much bloodshed to mistake peace for weakness. Once a war leader, his name had carried fear in army forts and respect among his people. Now, his purpose had narrowed to something more fragile, keeping peace for the small band who depended on him. He had come to trade cured hides for salt and flour. Nothing more, yet with every passing month, even simple exchanges grew dangerous. He felt the stares the moment his boots hit the dirt. The familiar weight of suspicion pressed down on him. White men seeing only braids and buckskin, never the man beneath. He was securing his mare to the hitching post outside Elra Santos's mercantile when trouble found him. 3 men from the red iron outfit spilled out of the saloon, faces flushed with liquor and sun, their bodies sour with sweat. Their boots scuffed the dust as they laughed, loud and cruel. "Well now," the thick-necked one sneered, lips curling. "Look what wandered in. Another horse thief." Riven did not turn. He finished tying the reins, his movements slow, controlled. He had heard the insult more times than he could count. Words like those were pebbles tossed by fools, only harmful if you let them strike true. "Fine-looking horse," another man said, stepping closer. "Too fine for you. Where'd you steal her from?" Riven turned then, unhurried. His gaze stayed level. Anger never crossed his face. Anger was a weakness he could not afford. "She's mine," he said quietly. The big man barked a laugh, harsh and ugly. "Your horse? Apache don't own nothing a white man don't own better." He lunged and grabbed the reins. "We'll be taking her back to whoever you lifted her from." Riven's hand moved, not to his knife, but to the man's wrist. His grip was steady, unbreakable. "Let go of my horse." For a heartbeat, the force in his voice held the man frozen. Then the others surged forward, whiskey-fueled bravado spilling over. "Pull him down," one shouted. "Teach the savage a lesson." Hands clawed at Riven's arms, trying to drag him from the saddle. The air filled with curses and grunts. Riven braced himself, legs locked tight against the Pinto's sides. He would not fall into the dirt. Losing his seat meant losing more than balance. It meant surrendering the last scrap of dignity he still possessed. Just as the struggle teetered on the edge of violence, the sharp rattle of an approaching stagecoach cut through the chaos. It thundered into town, wheels pounding, dust exploding behind it. 4 exhausted horses pulled it to a halt in front of the hotel. The door swung open. A woman stepped down. She was not what Santo Dedo usually received. Young, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark, honey-colored hair pinned back against the heat. Loose strands framing a face pale with exhaustion, but firm with resolve. Her dress was simple, dark blue cotton, stained red with dust like everything else in town. This was Briar Holt, a trained teacher and nurse who had crossed half a country to leave poverty behind and carve out something new with her own hands. Her clear gray eyes took in the scene in one sweep. The men grappling, the frightened horse, the crowd pressing closer. She did not hesitate. She walked straight toward the trouble. "Let him go," she said. Her voice was calm, not loud, yet it carried authority enough to slow them. The big man twisted toward her, still gripping Riven. "This don't concern you, miss. We're dealing with a horse thief." Before she could answer, the third man let out a strangled groan and collapsed face first into the dirt. His body jerked once, twice. His skin flushed an alarming red. The crowd murmured as the man lay twitching in the dust. "See?" the big man shouted, his hands shaking as he pointed. "He's done something to him. Apache witchwork, poison." A ripple of fear spread through the Dry Creek folk, but Briar Holt did not retreat. She dropped to her knees beside the collapsed man, her movements quick and sure. Dust smeared the hem of her dress as if it meant nothing. She pressed 2 fingers to the man's throat, then laid her palm against his burning skin. "He hasn't been poisoned?" she said sharply, her voice slicing through the rising panic. She lifted her gaze to the accuser. "Look at him. His skin is hot and dry, not cold. His breathing is fast and shallow, and his pulse is racing." She paused only long enough to let the words land. "Did he complain of a headache earlier? Act confused?" The big man blinked, stunned. Yeah, he kept babbling. Said the sun felt like a copper pot boiling his head." "Exactly," Briar said, precise and unshaken. "This man is suffering from sunstroke." She gestured toward the shade. "He's been working in this heat without enough water. His body can't cool itself anymore. Get him out of the sun. Cool his skin with water. Now, if you don't, he could die." She never raised her voice. She never threatened. Knowledge was her weapon, and it struck harder than any revolver. The anger drained from the crowd, replaced by sharp, shared urgency. The standoff collapsed under the weight of reason. A man stepped forward from the edge of the gathering, his face leathered by years of sun, but steady with decency. He was of average height, broad-shouldered, with eyes that didn't flinch easily. This was Caleb Holt, a former cavalryman turned cattle rancher, seasoned enough to recognize danger and foolishness when he saw it. "She's right," Caleb said evenly. "I've seen it take men down in the field." He pointed toward the trough. "Get him some shade. Water, slow and steady. Somebody fetch Dr. Thorne Kessler." Then his gaze hardened as it landed on the railroad man still gripping Riven's arm. "And you let him go. That's Riven. He's no thief." His voice carried authority earned the hard way. His people were in that canyon long before this town had a name. The grip loosened. The men backed off, shame mixing with confusion on their faces. Muted apologies followed as they hurried to tend their fallen companion. The crowd thinned, interest fading now that blood wouldn't be spilled. Riven remained mounted, straight-backed, hands resting calmly on the pommel. His eyes followed Briar as she issued quiet instructions, never once looking his way. She had not stepped in to defend an Apache. She had stepped in to save a life. And in her eyes, those were not the same thing. For the first time in many years, a white woman had looked at a moment involving him and chosen truth over prejudice. Something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. A fracture in the armor he had worn since the day soldiers had taken his betrothed, since the vow he'd made to walk alone, heart sealed shut. He guided his mare forward until he stood beside her. "You have my thanks," he said. The words felt thin. Briar Holt finally looked up. Their eyes met, hers clear and steady, his dark and guarded. And for a long moment, neither spoke. She saw not a savage, but a man shaped by loss and pride. He saw not interference, but strength forged by compassion. Anyone would have done the same, she said quietly. They both knew it wasn't true. Riven gave a slight nod, barely there, yet heavy with respect. Then he turned his horse and rode out of Santo Dito toward the canyon's cooling shadows, leaving Briar standing alone as red dust curled around her boots. From the shaded boardwalk before the saloon, Veric Slade had watched it all. Dust did not touch him. His suit remained clean, boots polished. A cigar rested between his fingers, smoke coiling lazily in the heat. He had seen Riven's quiet command. He had seen Caleb Holt's inconvenient sense of decency. And he had seen the woman, the calm eyes, the steady voice that bent a mob without force. To Veric, they were not people. They were obstacles. His railroad needed water. His cattle needed it even more. And the sacred spring in Canyon del Lobo was the richest source in the territory. Beside him, Marshal Cade Rowan shifted his weight, his belly straining against his vest, loyalty already sold. "Bit of a stir, Mr. Slade," he muttered. Veric exhaled smoke, eyes never leaving the canyon mouth. Every piece was moving now. Veric Slade kept his gaze fixed on the canyon long after Riven had vanished into its shadows. "Every man has a weakness," he said quietly. Beside him, Marshal Cade Rowan shifted his weight, a man shaped by excess and obedience. Slade drew slowly on his cigar, letting the smoke linger in his lungs before releasing it in a measured breath. "I used to think that Apache's weakness was pride," Slade continued. "His land, his stubbornness." He smiled faintly. "Now I'm starting to believe it's people." He had the law folded neatly into his pocket in the form of Rowan. He had a stack of papers, sealed, stamped, and conveniently vague, that claimed the spring as his own. All that remained in his way was one unyielding chief. And now, perhaps, a woman who refused to bow to fear. Across the street, Briar Holt watched Riven ride away until he became nothing more than a dark mark against the endless red earth. She had come west looking for renewal, a quiet place to teach, to heal, to begin again. But the hot wind against her face felt less like welcome and more like warning. The water here, she was beginning to understand, ran thicker than blood, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The fragile calm that settled over Santo Dito after the trouble at the Mercantile lay thin as frost on desert stone. It lasted less than a week. The spark that broke it came not with gunfire, but with paper. Veric Slade, flanked by Marshal Cade Rowan like a well-fed guard dog, nailed a notice to the board outside the hotel. The document was heavy with official seals and ornamental script. By authority of the territorial governor, it declared, Slade and the railroad had been granted exclusive rights to the water flowing from the spring in Canyon del Lobo. The Dry Creek folk gathered to read it, their low murmurs thick with unease. Slade stepped onto the boardwalk, sensing his moment. His voice carried the smooth cadence of reason, dangerous in its calm. "I know this looks sudden," he said, "but this is progress. This is the future of Santo Dito." He spread his hands. "The railroad needs a dependable water stop to bring prosperity. My cattle need water to feed this growing nation. We'll be building a small, temporary dam, just enough to regulate the flow. There'll be water for everyone." "Everyone?" Caleb Holt pushed forward through the crowd, jaw tight. "That spring is the only water the people of Stone Wind Camp have. Their crops, their animals, everything depends on it." Rowan puffed out his chest. "Law's the law, Caleb." He tapped the notice. "This here's legal. As for the Apache, he shrugged. There's plenty of room up at the San Carlos reservation. The word reservation dropped like a stone into silence. Its meaning needed no explanation. Slow hunger, broken spirits. At the edge of the crowd, Briar Holt stood frozen, the paper she'd carried from Elra Santos's mercantile forgotten in her hand. For days, she had been clearing out a narrow storeroom behind the shop. Elra, quiet and kind, had rented it to her cheap. It was small, dusty, but it had a window. She'd scrubbed the floor already, imagined children's voices filling the space, imagined shelves of medicine, a place to tend the sick. She had hoped for a gentle beginning. The notice on the board felt like the ground shifting beneath her feet. That afternoon, drawn by unease, she walked toward the canyon. Not far, just to where scrubland gave way to rising stone. There she saw the child. The girl was no more than 7 or 8, sitting beneath the thin shade of a mesquite tree. Her mother knelt beside her, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. Even at a distance, Briar knew something was wrong. The child's skin was pale beneath its copper tone. She trembled despite the heat. Briar approached slowly. "Hello," she said gently. The mother looked up, fear and fierce protectiveness warring in her eyes. She spoke softly in her own language. Briar raised her hands, palms open. "I'm a nurse," she said, pointing to herself. "May I see your child?" The woman hesitated, then nodded. Briar knelt, her trained eye taking in the signs, the shaking, the burning skin, the faint yellow cast around the eyes. Her stomach sank, malaria. "She needs quinine," Briar murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "And clean water." She mimed drinking, pointed back toward town, trying to explain she could help. But the woman shook her head. Mistrust hardened her expression. She gathered her daughter and hurried away, disappearing into the folds of the canyon. Briar remained where she was, watching them go. The child was sick, and because of the invisible wall dividing their worlds, she might die. That invisible wall, Briar Holt understood now, was exactly what Veric Slade and Marshal Cade Rowan were determined to raise higher, stone by stone, using laws, paper, and a dam. The realization hardened something inside her. Leaving was no longer an option. Turning away was no longer possible. The very next day, as if fate meant to seal that decision, she witnessed another moment that fixed her resolve beyond doubt. She saw Veric Slade ride toward the canyon, not with surveyors or engineers, but flanked by 2 armed men. Later, Caleb Holt told her the truth. Slade had gone to see Riven. It was never meant to be a discussion. It was an ultimatum, dressed up as courtesy. The meeting unfolded beneath the towering canyon walls, silent witnesses to what was said. Riven stood with 2 of his warriors, his expression carved from stone. Slade remained mounted, looking down as he spoke. "Riven," he said, the name sounding awkward and stripped of respect. "I'm a reasonable man. I believe in contracts." He smiled thinly. "My company will pay your people a monthly sum. In return, you ensure my dam stands undisturbed. My workers move freely. Call it protection." Riven's eyes did not soften. He understood the meaning clearly. It was an offer to sell his people's birthright for coins, to become a hired guard on land that had never belonged to Slade. It was theft wrapped in polite language. "The water is not for sale," Riven said evenly. "It belongs to the people. It belongs to the land." Slade's smile tightened. "Everything has a price. You'd be wise to accept." He leaned forward slightly. "The alternative is unpleasant. The army remembers. Always." The threat lingered between them. echoes of burned villages and forced marches. But Riven did not blink. "We will not leave our home," he said. "We will not sell our water." Then, with a finality no threat could match, he turned his back. "Your dam will not stand." He walked away, leaving Veric Slade staring after him, fury darkening his face. The lines were drawn. That evening, Briar Holt finalized her arrangement with Elra Santos. The small storeroom behind the mercantile was hers. She unpacked her books, laid out her medical tools. The act itself felt like a declaration. She was staying. She would open her school. She would offer healing to anyone who needed it, white or Apache. She knew the road she had chosen would not be kind. The whispers had already begun, the sideways looks. In Santo Dato, a woman who defended the people of Stone Wind Camp, even quietly, stepped outside accepted boundaries. It threatened every fragile connection she had hoped to build. The fear was familiar. The fear of being unwanted, of standing alone. The same fear that had driven her west in the first place. A few nights later, a soft knock sounded at the back door of the mercantile. When Briar opened it, Riven stood there alone, a dark silhouette in the moonlight. For a moment, neither spoke. "You are the nurse," he said at last. It was not a question. "Yes," she replied, her pulse quickening. "Our people fall ill," he continued. "The children. Winter will be harsh. I saw a young girl days ago. She was very sick." Riven nodded once. "She has improved. Our medicine helped this time. But it does not always." His gaze drifted past her, into the small, orderly room. The lantern glow, the stacked books, the cot, the glass bottles waiting on the shelf. A refuge taking shape. "You wish to help," he said. "I wish to teach," Briar answered. "And to heal. Anyone who needs it." He studied her for a long while, weighing danger against necessity. Letting an outsider this close carried risk. But he had seen her courage. He had heard truth in her voice when she spoke of the man struck down by the sun. As a leader, survival allowed no simple answers. "Winter snow will close the canyon," he said at last. "I will make an agreement." She held her breath. "You may build a small shelter, a medical tent, near the edge of our lands. You may treat those who come to you." The offer left her stunned. It was more than she had dared hope, but his voice remained firm. "You will not go to the sacred spring. You will not interfere with our ceremonies. You will respect our ways." He met her eyes. "If you do this, you will be safe." It was a truce. Nothing more than a narrow plank laid across a deep gulf of suspicion. For Riven, it was a decision born of necessity. His people needed help, and this was a way to secure it. Yet beneath that practicality stirred something more dangerous. He was breaking the vow of solitude that had protected his heart for years. He was not opening his heart, but he was opening his world. And with it came the old, familiar fear of loss. For Briar Holt, the agreement was a lifeline. It gave her purpose and ground to stand on. She understood the risks. She was stepping deeper into a struggle that had not begun with her, yet now seemed inseparable from her future. A lone woman caught between the ruthless will of Veric Slade and the unyielding resolve of Riven. "I agree to your terms," she said steadily, holding his gaze. "I will respect your ways." He answered with the same slight, formal nod he had given her in the street. Then he turned away, dissolving back into the darkness as silently as he had arrived. Briar closed the door, her palm resting against the rough wood. Conflict had taken root all across Santo Dato, fed by greed and fear. But in this small room, sealed by a quiet agreement, a different seed had been planted. Whether it would grow into hope or sorrow, she could not yet know. She only knew she had to stay and see it through. Building the clinic was an act of faith in defiance of the wind. Breyer chose the spot Riven had indicated, a flat stretch of stone at the edge of Stone Wind Camp, close enough to the trail from town to be seen, yet exposed to the open sky. There was no shelter from the sun, no mercy from the restless wind sweeping down from the high mesas. The canvas tent, bought with nearly all her remaining money, snapped and strained like a living thing as she and Caleb Holt fought to raise it. Caleb arrived one morning with his wagon, unannounced, carrying scrap lumber for a floor, a crate of nails, and a quiet determination to help. He spoke little. His hammer struck a steady rhythm against the wind. He told her it was the right thing to do. And for a man like Caleb, that was reason enough. Inside, the tent became a fragile pocket of order in a vast wilderness. A sturdy table from Caleb's wagon served as her examination surface. Shelves held her precious bottles, laudanum, carbolic acid, quinine. A narrow cot was folded against the canvas wall. It was a delicate shelter, a pale marker of hope that seemed ready to be torn away by the next hard gust. Yet once the canvas was secured and a lantern lit, the space held warmth, a sense of refuge against the creeping dark. Her first and most important ally from Stone Wind Camp arrived on the second day. Her name was Kayla. Barely 19, she moved with quick, fluid grace, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She lingered near the tent, silent and watchful, until Breyer struggled to understand an elderly woman describing a persistent cough. In that moment of hesitation, Kayla stepped forward and translated in careful but clear English. From then on, she became Breyer's shadow, her interpreter, her bridge into a world Breyer could never have entered alone. Kayla learned quickly. Soon she was not only translating, but cleaning instruments, preparing water, and soothing frightened children with soft words in their own tongue. Supplies vanished faster than Breyer had expected. Elra Santos, the mercantile owner, proved another quiet partner in her work. When she came to him for bandages or liniment, he would nod, retrieve the items, and mark a line in a ledger kept beneath the counter. He always refused payment, telling her calmly that there would be time for that later. He knew, as she did, that she was making powerful enemies. This was his way of standing beside her. For the first few weeks, her work followed a steady rhythm of ordinary suffering, fevers in children, a broken arm carefully set, skin rashes caused by endless dust and heat. Trust came slowly, earned one careful act at a time. The people of Stone Wind Camp were cautious. Their history with white settlers was a long lesson in betrayal. But when pain eased and children recovered, suspicion began to soften. The true test came not from the canyon, but from the railroad. Sickness swept through the labor camp without warning, a violent, draining flux that left men weak and burning with fever. The workers lived in filth downstream from where Veric Slade's men had begun early dam construction. Their water came from a shallow, muddy seep fouled by their own waste. The camp foreman, Grimhatcher, dismissed it as bad whiskey, until 3 men collapsed and a 4th raved in delirium. Panic followed. One of the workers, the same man Breyer had treated for sunstroke weeks earlier, remembered her and rode hard for her tent. She found the camp steeped in misery. The air reeked of sickness. Men lay groaning on filthy blankets beneath scraps of shade. Grim stepped in front of her, suspicion hardening his face. "We don't need help from an Apache sympathizer," he snapped. Breyer walked past him without a word. She knelt beside the nearest man and began her examination. The signs were unmistakable. She turned to the men watching. "Your water is poisoned," she said firmly. "Not by malice, but by filth." Silence followed. And in that silence, the consequences of Slade's dam began to take shape. She explained it plainly, using words even exhausted men could grasp. They had to stop drinking from the seep at once. Every drop of water, she told them, must be boiled for no less than 10 minutes before it was safe. She showed them how to make a rough but workable soap from rendered fat and wood ash, insisting they scrub their hands after tending the sick. For 2 days, she worked without rest, moving from man to man. She gave laudanum to ease the cramps and forced them to drink boiled, cooled water. Kyla, who refused to leave her side, proved indispensable. Her calm efficiency steadied the camp. Slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. 2 of the men who had been closest to death showed signs of recovery. Hope crept in, fragile, tentative. On the 3rd day, Veric Slade rode into the camp. He surveyed the scene with cold appraisal. One of the laborers had died during the night, his body too far gone before Briar Holt had arrived. Slade seized the death like a weapon. Standing before the weakened men, he pointed directly at Briar. He declared that her strange medicines were the true cause of their suffering. He called her treatments witchcraft, meant to weaken them, to drive them from the land. His voice was smooth, persuasive. Fear took root in tired minds. Some of the men began to murmur in agreement. Grim Hatcher, the foreman, ordered her to leave. Briar stood her ground. Her face was drawn with exhaustion and anger as she told them plainly they were fools to listen to him. But the crowd had turned. With a heavy heart, she packed her bag and left, calling back one last time for them to keep boiling the water. She and Kayla walked back to the tent in silence. Defeat pressed down on them both. She had saved lives, yet earned exile in return. The divide between her and the town had deepened. Days later, a sudden shout from Stone Wind Camp sent Kayla running. A child chasing a lizard had sprinted toward a thicket of chala cactus. Riven, who had been nearby, moved faster than thought. He shoved the boy clear, but his own forearm scraped through the spined branches. Kayla brought him to Briar's tent. He stood without speaking, arm held rigid at his side, his face set like stone. The wound was not deep, but it was vicious, long, bloody, and packed with dozens of needle-sharp spines. Briar's expression hardened into calm focus. She motioned for him to sit and told Kayla to explain that the spines had to be removed before the wound could be cleaned. It would hurt. Riven gave a single nod, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the canvas wall. By lantern light, Briar worked carefully, drawing out each spine with fine tweezers. He did not flinch. He made no sound, though she saw his jaw tighten. When the last spine was gone, she washed the gash with water and carbolic acid. It would need stitches. She threaded a needle, her hands steady, and explained through Kayla what she was about to do. Again, he nodded. She placed her left hand gently on his forearm to steady it. His skin was warm, the muscle beneath firm as seasoned oak. It was the first time they had touched, deliberate, unhurried. Something passed between them, an unspoken recognition of the closeness of the act. She was not merely closing a wound. She was mending flesh long guarded against tenderness. Her stitches were small and precise. Riven never shifted his gaze. When she finished, she wrapped the arm securely. She told him to keep it clean and return in a few days so she could check it. He stood, looked down at the clean white bandage, then lifted his eyes to hers. He gave a single, solemn nod and left the tent. The next evening, as the sun dropped behind the canyon walls and shadows stretched long. He returned. He stood at the tent entrance, waiting. His hand was closed around something. When Briar stepped outside, he opened his palm. Resting there was a perfect arrowhead, chipped from black obsidian. Beautiful, deadly. Its edges were still razor-sharp, the volcanic glass drinking in the last of the light. He offered it to her. His words were spoken softly in his own language. Kayla, standing nearby, translated. A life saved created a debt. His arm was meant to protect his people. By healing it, she had protected them all. The arrowhead was the mark of that debt. Briar reached out and took it. The obsidian was cool and smooth against her skin, yet it felt heavy, weighted with meaning far beyond its size. It was a token of a vow, spoken in a language of honor Briar Holt was only beginning to learn. The arrowhead carried the memory of pain, of trust freely given in a moment of shared vulnerability. She lowered her gaze from the obsidian resting in her palm to the man standing before her. Riven's arm, wrapped in clean white cloth, cut a sharp line against the deepening dusk. Behind her, the small medical tent snapped and shivered in the rising breeze, a fragile pocket of warmth standing stubbornly against a vast and unforgiving land. In that moment, she understood that this sliver of sharpened stone was more than a gift. It was a bond, tying her to this place and to him, with a strength no rope could match. The desert could heal, but it could also strike. The sky did not darken as storms usually did. Instead, it bruised into a sickly yellow. The wind, ever present until then, dropped into an unnatural silence. Birds vanished. The air thickened, heavy enough to make each breath feel deliberate. Briar stood at the mouth of her tent, unease knotting in her chest. Nearby, Kyla, grinding herbs, lifted her eyes to the sky. Her face went still. She spoke a single word in her own language, low, grave, final. Then the wind returned, not as a whisper, but as a roar. A towering wall of red dust surged across the plains, swallowing mountains and sky alike. The wind became a physical force, ripping at the canvas of the clinic as if intent on tearing it from the earth. Briar and Kayla lunged for the flaps, skirts snapping around their legs as the tent groaned. Ropes screamed against their stakes. Darkness fell in an instant, a choking, gritty black that burned her eyes and filled her mouth and lungs. Inside, the lantern flame thrashed wildly, casting frantic shadows across the canvas. The structure shuddered, threatening to collapse or be ripped free and hurled into the desert. Time lost meaning. There was only the wind's fury, the sense of the world being scoured raw. When the storm finally passed, it left silence behind. Everything lay buried beneath fine red dust. The air turned strangely cool, but the storm had left one final cruelty. A jagged bolt of lightning had stabbed into a stand of dry creosote bushes not far from the tent. Now, a thin tongue of orange flame crept through the grass, spreading with terrifying speed as the breeze returned. "Fire!" Kayla cried, panic sharp in her voice. The word jolted the camp into motion. Flames raced forward like a living thing, devouring the dry brush between Stone Wind Camp and the clinic. Sparks leapt ahead, birthing smaller fires wherever they fell. The canvas tent, built of cloth and resolve, stood squarely in the fire's path. Chaos erupted, swift and purposeful. Riven was there. His voice rolled low and commanding through the panic. He sent the women gathering children, directing them toward the shallow caves carved into the canyon base. Men appeared with shovels and wet blankets. A human chain formed, stretching from the creek, feeding the spring to the fire's edge. Caleb Holt arrived as if drawn by the smoke itself, his wagon rattling in behind him, water barrels clattering. He joined the bucket line without a word. Briar took her place between Caleb and Kayla, her face streaked with dust and sweat. A heavy bucket slammed into her hands. She passed it forward. An empty one came back. Again. Again. Her muscles burned. Smoke clawed at her lungs, tears streaming from her eyes. Heat struck in waves, threatening to buckle her knees. She saw Riven at the very edge of the flames, beating them back with a soaked blanket. His movements were precise, fearless. For one horrifying moment, a gust sent a wall of fire surging toward him, and her heart locked tight in her chest. But he flowed backward with dancer's grace, never losing focus. His body was a weapon forged against the inferno. He was not only fighting fire, he was defending his home, his people, and the small, stubborn tent that had come to mean something he had not yet named. They fought for hours. Not Apache, not white, just people. Faces blackened with soot, bodies driven by the same desperate will to endure. At last, as dawn bled pale light across the sky, the final flames died. The village stood. The tent stood. They remained there in the gray morning, a battered, exhausted army surveying the cost, a wide black scar cut through the land. The air smelled of ash and wet earth. And for the first time, the desert was quiet again. Briar Holt's hands were blistered and raw. Her body throbbed in places she hadn't known could ache. Yet beneath the pain, a fierce sense of triumph stirred inside her. They had stood against the desert's fury, and they had not broken. But Veric Slade did not fight with fire. He fought with patience, with silence, with pressure applied slowly in the dark, while Stonewind Camp recovered, while Briar treated burns and smoke-filled lungs. His men worked unseen. They used no explosives, no machines that announced themselves. Only shovels, saws, and mules moving quietly through the night. By sunrise 2 days after the fire, the damage was done. It was Riven who discovered it. He had gone to the sacred spring at dawn, as he always did, to pray. What he found stopped him cold. The place where clear water once spilled freely from the rock, feeding the creek that sustained his people, had been strangled by a crude dam of raw lumber and packed earth. The flow was not fully stopped, but reduced to a pitiful trickle. The spring's voice, once a lively song, had been silenced to a dying whisper. A hard, unfamiliar anger settled into Riven's chest. He followed the newly laid pipes away from the dam, over a low rise, toward the railroad line. The theft had been efficient. Quiet. Devastating. By midday, the damage was visible. Goats and sheep clustered around the nearly dry creek bed, bleeding in distress. Plants that had once thrived beneath the sun already showed signs of withering. Panic crept through the camp, slow, corrosive. Water was life. Without it, winter would kill them. To lose the spring was to lose their home. Before Riven could decide his next move, riders arrived. Marshal Cade Rowan rode into the village with 2 deputies. He stayed mounted, his belly spilling over the saddle horn, a smug grin tugging at his mouth. "Riven," he called loudly. "Got a complaint here from Mr. Slade." He waved a paper. "Claims you and your people have been threatening his work crew, sabotaging lawful property." Riven met his gaze, face unreadable. "His property is on our land. He is stealing our water." Rowan flicked the paper open. "According to this here document, the water belongs to him." He paused. "For threatening illegal enterprise, I'm fining you $100. He smiled thinly. "Payable in cash or horses. I'll take 5 of your best." It was extortion. Nothing more, no trial, no proof. Just a lawman bought and paid for. Riven knew he could not fight them. Not here, not now. Violence would bring soldiers, and that was a battle his people could not survive. Without a word, he signaled for the horses. The fine was paid, the injustice complete. That night, pressure closed in from another direction. The Iron Elders came to his wickiup, their faces grave, their voices heavy with worry. Brask, whose weathered face carried the map of many winters, spoke for them all. "Our water fades," Brask said. "Slade presses harder. Winter comes." He leaned forward. "We are few. We need allies. We need strength." Then came the words Riven had long dreaded. "A leader needs a wife. Children to carry his spirit. You must marry. Show our enemies we endure." They had spoken of this before, gently. Now it was no suggestion. It was a demand. There were strong women among the people, capable and worthy. But Riven shook his head. His refusal was quiet, absolute. "I have sworn a vow," he said, the words bitter in his mouth. "I will not marry." That vow was a wall built around the hollow space in his chest. To love again was to offer fate another hostage, another weakness for men like Slade to exploit. He would lead, he would fight, he would die for his people, but he would do it alone. The elders left in silence, disappointment hanging heavy in the small dwelling. Briar Holt heard the rumors later, from Kayla. She learned of the pressure on Riven to marry, of his unwavering refusal. Something unfamiliar stirred in her chest. She told herself it was none of her concern. But the feeling did not fade. She reminded herself she was only a guest here, a temporary presence. Her purpose was to mend flesh and ease pain, not to stitch together the torn fabric of a people's fate, nor to step into the private sorrow of their chief. She was a passerby, a witness, nothing more. She repeated the thought each night inside the quiet of her tent. Yet the words rang thinner every time she spoke them. This land was no longer something she merely passed through. The fire, the bucket line, the shared terror and hard-won relief had burned away her distance. The obsidian arrowhead, kept wrapped in soft cloth, felt warm when she held it. A reminder of a debt that reached far beyond courtesy or custom. Life had begun to move faster. The slow rhythm of endurance had broken into a desperate run, and with a certainty that unsettled her, Briar Holt knew she was running alongside them. Market day in Santo Dedo marked a fragile ceasefire in the town's daily battle with the desert. Once a week, the vast silence gave way to noise and motion. Dust rose beneath mule hooves, wagon wheels, and booted feet. Ranchers, miners, and men from the Red Iron outfit crowding the square. The air carried a heavy blend of smells. Fresh bread drifting from the hotel kitchen, leather warming under the sun, onions and peppers spread on blankets, and the ever-present scent of livestock. It was a day for bargaining and gossip, for brief connection, a sudden bloom of life in harsh ground. Briar came with a short list scrawled on scrap paper. Cotton for bandages. More carbolic acid, if Elra Santos still had any. Beans and flour for herself and Kayla. Since the fire, the clinic had known no rest, and supplies were running thin. She moved through the crowd with quiet intent, nodding to familiar faces. A few nodded back. Most turned away. Murmurs followed her like drifting smoke. The town had not forgiven her, for tending the railroad men or for standing openly with the people of Stone Wind Camp. Compassion had marked her as an outsider. Riven was there as well. He had brought a bundle of carefully cured deer and rabbit hides to trade for salt, a resource more precious than coin to his people. He remained at the edge of the market, tall and still, drawing looks of fear and resentment in equal measure. He spoke briefly with Elra, business handled in low, measured words. His face gave nothing away. The stolen water pressed constantly at his thoughts. The fine forced upon him by Marshal Cade Rowan still burned. The words of the Iron Elders echoed in his mind, urging him to take a wife, to strengthen his people, to abandon the vow that had become both shield and cage. Their paths crossed near the public well, not by design, but by the simple pull of the crowd. For a moment, they stood close without speaking, each acutely aware of the other. The air between them seemed to tighten, as if drawn taut. That silent moment did not go unnoticed. Rhea Mallory saw them. A young widow whose husband had died of fever the previous winter, she carried her grief like sharpened glass. Pretty in a brittle way, she had once made her ambitions known, seeking the security of a man with land and standing. She had even, briefly and foolishly, set her sights on the untouchable Apache chief. Riven had dismissed her with courteous finality, and admiration had curdled into resentment. Now, seeing him beside the woman the whole town whispered about, she sensed opportunity. Rhea stood among a cluster of ranchers' wives, the Dry Creek folk who appointed themselves guardians of propriety. "Well," she said lightly, her voice carrying just enough, "it seems our little saint has found her savage." Laughter fluttered, sharp and mean. The remarks followed quickly. "I heard she keeps a tent right beside their camp. That's disgraceful. What do you reckon she does out there all night?" Briar's spine stiffened. She kept her eyes down, focused on finishing her errands. But the whispers grew louder, bolder, circling in. Riven stood unmoving, gaze fixed on the distant hills, as though the insults were wind passing over stone. Rhea stepped forward, emboldened. "You'd best be careful," she called out clearly. "Miss Holt." A thin smile curved her lips. "He'll never have you. Everyone knows the Apache chief turns away the women of his own people. What makes you think he'd want you?" Her voice sharpened. A wide-eyed virgin playing at fascination with a red-skinned chief. The insult struck where it was meant to. Race, reputation, desire laid bare. The market fell quiet. Conversation stopped. This was better than a dogfight. All eyes turned toward them. This was a deliberate, public humiliation. Heat rushed to Briar Holt's face. For a heartbeat, she wanted to turn away, to vanish into the noise and dust, to escape the weight of every eye fixed on her. The market square felt suddenly too small, too tight, as if the town itself had closed in. She glanced at Riven and saw the tension carved into his posture, the hard line of his jaw, the expressionless mask barely containing fury and restraint. He was bound by more than pride. To speak, to defend her openly, would risk violence and consequences that would fall not on him alone, but on his people. He stood trapped, and she understood it in a single, sharp breath. Something inside her shifted. Not anger. Something cleaner. Sharper. She saw his silence for what it was. Pain held in check, and understood that Rhea Mallory's cruelty was aimed not at her, but at the vow that kept him isolated. The mockery cut at the core of who he was. Briar would not allow it. She did not shout. She did not insult. She stepped forward, one measured step, closing the small space between herself and Riven. The crowd seemed to inhale as one. She lifted her hand and rested it gently against his forearm, not on the leather sleeve, but on the faint, pale scar beneath. The thin line she herself had stitched weeks earlier. The mark left by cactus thorns, the wound taken while protecting a child, their shared history. Riven stiffened, not from pain, but from surprise. His eyes dropped to her hand, then lifted to her face. Briar turned toward the crowd, not toward Rhea. Her voice was calm, steady, and carried clearly across the silent square. "The Apache chief refused every bride," she said. Her fingers pressed lightly against the healed scar. "Until one gentle virgin touch broke his sacred vow." The words hung in the air. They were bold, shocking, unmistakably deliberate. It was not a claim, not a proposal, not a plea. It was a truth aimed straight at Riven's heart. She was not taking him. She was challenging the fear that bound him, naming the wall he had built, and proving it was not unbreakable. The market froze. Mules stood still. Bargaining died mid-sentence. Rhea Mallory's mouth fell open, her expression stripped of triumph and replaced with stunned disbelief. The ranchers' wives stared as if carved from stone. Riven felt her touch like a brand seared through cloth and skin. He looked down at her, at the quiet resolve in her eyes, and something inside him cracked wide open. It was not shame that surged through him. It was recognition. For the first time in his life, someone had seen past his authority, past his silence, past the vow he wore like armor, and named the loneliness beneath it. She had not mocked his promise. She had exposed its fragility. The moment stretched, taut, shimmering. Then Caleb Holt broke it. He stepped forward, clapped his hands together once, loud and sharp. "Well," he drawled dryly, "now that the wedding announcements are done, some of us might like to buy flour before it gets hotter than the devil's forge." A ripple of uneasy laughter followed. Boots shuffled. People looked away, suddenly embarrassed by their own attention. The spell shattered. The women who had flanked Rhea drifted off with forced nonchalance, leaving her standing alone, face flushed with anger and defeat. From the shaded boardwalk of the saloon, Veric Slade had watched everything. He drew slowly on his cigar, eyes narrowing with calculation. He had seen the challenge, the shock in the Apache chief's eyes, the connection laid bare in a single touch. Veric Slade understood leverage. He had always believed that to control a man, you controlled what he valued most. He had assumed that for Riven, it was land, water. Now he knew better. The Apache chief's greatest vulnerability was no longer a place. It was a person. And she had just revealed it to the entire town. The ride back from Santo Dedo was a silent one. Briar Holt and Riven parted at the edge of Santo Dedo without a single word, each retreating into the shelter of their own world. Yet the silence between them was false. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the aftershock of what she had said in the market square. Briar felt a tremor of fear at her own boldness. Beneath it, however, lay a deep, immovable certainty. She had done what was necessary. Riven rode away with a storm locked behind his impassive face. Her words had turned a key in a door he had believed sealed by rust and time. She had seen him, and that knowledge was both freeing and terrifying. That night, the desert grew unnaturally still. The wind vanished as if holding its breath. Stars hung sharp and close, like shards of ice pinned to the black sky. Sleep came to no one easily. There was a sense of something fragile, something borrowed, that could not endure unchanged. The attack came in the deepest hour of night, the hour of ghosts and hunters. It was not sound that woke Briar, but smell. The sharp bite of burning pine mixed with something heavier and sweeter, like grain roasting too long. Then came a scream, a single terrified cry that tore through the dark, followed by a chorus of panicked shouts. Briar bolted from her cot, yanking on her boots and snatching her medical bag. Outside the tent, the sight stole her breath. Against the sheer black walls of the canyon, a monstrous orange bloom was rising. The large, solid wickiup that served as the village's communal storehouse, the place where dried corn, smoked meat, and winter nuts were kept, was fully aflame. This was no wandering brush fire. This was deliberate. A calculated act of cruelty aimed straight at survival, an attempt to starve them before the first snow ever fell. Stone Wind Camp erupted into frantic motion, yet there was order beneath the chaos. Riven stood silhouetted against the fire, his voice not shouting, but cutting cleanly through the panic with precise commands. The blaze was already too far gone for buckets and blankets. The roof glowed like a web of embers. The priority was salvage. "The children!" someone cried, and Briar's purpose snapped into focus. She and Kayla ran toward the residential wickiups, voices calm but urgent as they gathered frightened, coughing children. Together, they guided them away from the smoke and heat, toward the cool, dark mouths of the shallow caves at the canyon's base. Blankets were laid out. Reassurances were whispered, words neither woman fully believed. Once the children were safe, Briar ran back toward the fire. A line of men and women had formed, passing sacks and clay pots away from the inferno. Heat struck like a solid wall. Smoke wrapped her lungs in a choking grip. She took her place in the line, hands clutching rough burlap, eyes streaming, throat raw. They worked with silent desperation, rescuing what they could. Then the main support beam groaned, a deep, terrible sound of surrender. Sparks cascaded down. Part of the thatched roof collapsed inward, sending a geyser of flame into the night. "It's lost! Get back!" Riven ordered, his voice hoarse. The line broke. People stumbled away from the heat. And in that instant, Briar saw it. Just inside the burning doorway, a small leather-wrapped bundle lay on the ground. She knew it instantly. Rare medicinal herbs, gathered all summer by one of the elder women. Herbs vital for treating the lung sicknesses of winter. Briar did not think. She moved. She slipped under a man's arm as he tried to stop her, held her breath, and plunged into the smoke-filled entrance. Heat slammed into her like a furnace blast. She grabbed the bundle, the leather scorching hot, then turned to flee. But the smoke thickened into black poison. It filled her lungs. The world spun into a gray blur. Her knees gave way, and the packed earth rushed up to meet her. She woke to the feel of ground beneath her, and a hand crushing hers. Not gentle. Desperate. As if someone were anchoring her to life by force alone. She coughed, harsh and dry, fire tearing through her chest. Her vision slowly cleared. Riven was kneeling beside her. His face was inches from hers, streaked with soot. His hair was singed. His breathing came in harsh, broken gasps. But it was his eyes that held her. Gone was the stoic reserve. Gone was the calm of a leader. In their dark depths, she saw raw, unguarded fear. The look of a man who had stared into the abyss and nearly lost something precious beyond endurance. He felt her move, saw her eyes flutter open, and a sharp tremor tore through his entire body. His grip on her hand eased, but he did not release it. He said nothing. He could not. He only watched her. His breathing still came in uneven bursts, as if he were the one dragged from the smoke. Between them lay the fading roar of the dying fire, and the silent, crushing weight of his relief. He helped her sit up, his hand sliding to her back to steady her. The closeness was raw, stripped of all pretense by terror. It was not born of romance, but of danger shared. and the brutal knowledge of how near loss had come. Later, when the fire finally consumed itself and left behind a smoldering black skeleton beneath the pale dawn, Riven stood overlooking Stone Wind Camp. His people were exhausted, faces streaked with soot, eyes rimmed with fear. But they were alive. The children were safe. Briar Holt sat near the creek, pale yet breathing steadily. Alive. The storehouse was gone, a devastating wound. Yet, as Riven looked at his people and at Briar, something heavy and unmistakable settled inside him. He had forged his vow of solitude as armor against loss. He had believed that refusing love would spare him the agony he once knew. But watching the flames devour their winter stores, watching Briar collapse into smoke, he understood the truth. The fear had never been love itself. The fear was failing to protect those he loved. His vow was not a shield. It was a prison. It had not kept pain out. It had kept purpose from getting in. He felt the stone wall around his heart shudder. For the first time in 10 years, a deep crack split its foundation. The sun rose on grim resolve. The people of Stone Wind Camp sifted through ashes, faces set and unbroken. They had been struck, but they had not fallen. Their enemies allowed no time to recover. Just after midday, Marshal Cade Rowan rode into the camp with 4 heavily armed deputies. A folded warrant sat in his hand. "Riven," Rowan announced, his voice slick with false authority. "This morning, Veric Slade filed a formal complaint with the county magistrate. He submitted maps and titles claiming legal ownership of the spring's water." He lifted the paper. "He also swore that you personally threatened his workers and conspired to sabotage his property." Caleb Holt, who had arrived with a wagon of salvaged lumber and food from his own stores, stepped forward. "That's a lie, Marshal, and you know it. Riven hasn't done any such thing." Rowan ignored him. "By authority of the Arizona Territory," he continued, "I am placing you under arrest for threatening a public works project and conspiracy to commit sabotage." 2 deputies dismounted, hands resting on their pistols. Riven did not move. He looked at his people, at Kyla's angry tears, at Briar's stunned horror. He knew the trap. Any resistance would invite bloodshed and be named a riot. Soldiers would follow. He slowly raised his hands. The gesture was submission, but also defiance. He would not give them the violence they wanted. The deputies bound his wrists in rough rope. As they led him away, he passed Briar. Their eyes met. In his gaze she saw no defeat, only a silent command. "Be strong. Do not be afraid." As the posse rode out of the canyon with their prisoner, Caleb Holt turned to the ranchers who had come to help. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice hard and low. "This isn't law. It's theft. I'm riding to the county seat. I'll file a petition. I'll get every decent man in this valley to sign it. Slade may have bought the marshal, but he hasn't bought all of us." After Riven's arrest, the air in Stone Wind Camp turned thin and brittle, like an eggshell ready to crack. Hope had been carried away with their leader. People moved quietly, heavily. Despair etched deep into familiar lines. Briar felt crushed by helplessness. The law, meant to shield the innocent, had become a weapon. Caleb Holt had ridden out with his petition, a righteous but slow answer to a crisis that was already racing forward. Action was demanded now. Briar's mind, trained to diagnose, to treat, to act, searched for a remedy that was not medicine. She went to Elra Santos's mercantile at dusk, moving with purpose through the cooling air. The shop was closed, but a lone lantern glowed in the back room. She tapped softly at the rear door. Elra opened it, concern etched deep into his tired, kind face. Inside, she laid out her plan. It was risky, a reach into the dark. The railroad had brought more than iron tracks and hired hands to Santo Dato. It had brought the telegraph, a slender wire humming with unseen messages, linking their isolated town to the wider territory, to Prescott, to the seat of government itself. Veric Slade and Marshal Cade Rowan control this town, Breyer said in a low, urgent voice. But they do not control the territory. There are inspectors, magistrates not in Slade's pocket. If we can send a message, request an independent survey of the spring. Elra listened, fingers stroking his graying mustache. He nodded slowly. The telegraph operator is Finn Mercer. He's young, reads books, believes in fairness. But he's afraid of the marshal. We have to try, Breyer insisted. An hour later, they stood in the cramped telegraph office, the air sharp with ozone and metal. Finn, a boy barely 20, sandy hair tousled, hands unsteady, looked at them with wide, frightened eyes. Elra spoke calmly, laying out the injustice of Riven's arrest, the questionable claims of the railroad. Breyer drafted the message with surgical care. She wrote of the Apache's long-standing claim to the water, the suspicious documents produced by the railroad, the rising tensions that threatened violence. On behalf of concerned citizens of Santo Dato, she formally requested an immediate, impartial survey by a territorial land agent. Finn's hands shook as he read it. Sending the message meant defiance. It could cost him his job, or worse. He looked at Breyer's steady resolve, at Elra's unwavering gaze. Something sparked. He sat at the key, his fingers found their rhythm. The room filled with the sharp, staccato click of the telegraph. Small metallic beats carrying hope into the vast, dark reach of the territory. The answer from their enemy came faster and far crueler than any of them imagined. Veric Slade did not wait on petitions or inspectors. He understood that the quickest way to break a people was to steal their future. Kayla was that future. She went to the creek at dusk to gather cool stones for a feverish child, a task she had done 100 times in a place that had always been safe. But the world had changed. 2 men stepped from the cottonwood shadows, rough men who worked for wages and asked no questions. Kayla never had time to scream. A coarse hand clamped over her mouth. She was dragged into the dark. The news tore through Stone Wind Camp like a blade. Grief and terror were absolute. They had taken one of their own, a beloved daughter, the voice of what was to come. At dawn, the cell door in the Santo Dato jail swung open. It was not the marshal who stood there, but Veric Slade. Riven was brought into the sheriff's office. The room was stale with cigar smoke. On the desk lay a document, a treaty written in dense legal language, renouncing any and all Apache claims to the water of the sacred spring. Beside it rested a single eagle feather. Kayla's. A simple business matter, Chief, Slade said, his voice smooth as oiled gears. You sign this paper. The girl is returned, unharmed, perhaps shaken, but safe. You refuse. He let the sentence trail off, unfinished and terrifying. Marshal Rowan will release you, Slade continued, a gesture of good faith. You have until sunrise tomorrow to deliver the signed document to the dam site. After that, my offer expires. His eyes hardened. And so I fear, does the girl? Riven stepped back into the harsh daylight, a free man who had never felt more bound. He walked toward his people, each step weighted with an impossible choice. To sign would condemn them to a slow death, surrendering the very soul of their existence. To refuse would condemn Kayla. He reached Stone Wind Camp to to find his people gathered. Faces turned toward him, eyes filled with desperate hope. He told them the choice he had been given. A raw cry of grief tore from Kayla's mother, a sound so heavy it seemed to bend the air. The weight of leadership pressed down on Riven until it felt almost physical, a force meant to crush him. He could not sign the paper. He could not trade the life of his people for one soul, even a soul as precious as Kayla's. And he could not abandon her to whatever fate Veric Slade had planned. There was only one road left, the old road, the warrior's road. He began to prepare in silence, gathering his knife, a length of rope, and a small water pouch. He would go alone. This burden was his to carry. Briar Holt found him by the creek. His face was carved from cold fury and restrained despair. "You can't go alone," she said quietly, her voice steady. "This is not your fight," he replied without turning. His words were flat, emptied of emotion. "It is a matter for my people." "Kayla is my friend," Briar said, "and those men work for Slade. They'll expect you to come up the main canyon trail. They'll be watching for you." She paused. "But there's another way." He finally looked at her, suspicion narrowing his eyes. "When I first came here," she continued quickly, "I walked the hills to learn the land. I found an old prospector's trail, the one that climbs the back of Eagle's Tooth Rock. There's a bridge there, a suspension bridge made of rope and timber. It looks ruined, but the main anchors are still set into the stone. It's dangerous, but it will bring you above them, from behind. That's where a man would hide a prisoner." Riven stared at her, his mind working through every word. She wasn't offering sympathy. She was offering strategy, knowledge that unlocked the trap laid for him. To accept meant admitting he could not do this alone. It meant trusting her not only with his life, but with Kayla's. What little resistance he had left crumbled, not to logic, but to the undeniable truth that their paths were now bound together. They left as the moon climbed the sky, two silent figures dissolving into rock and shadow. The climb was brutal. Loose scree sliding beneath their boots, narrow ravines smelling of dust and cold stone cutting into their hands. At last, they reached the bridge. It was a nightmare of rotting planks and frayed ropes, swaying gently over a chasm of pure black. "I'll go first," Riven said. He tested the anchor lines, then stepped onto the bridge. His movements were light and precise, like a spider crossing a thread. He reached the far side and turned, a dark outline against the stars. Now it was her turn. Briar's heart hammered in her chest. She fixed her eyes on Riven, her single point of certainty. Hand over hand on the rope railing, boots finding precarious holds on the weathered boards. One plank groaned beneath her weight. She froze, breath locked in her throat. She felt his gaze on her, steady, commanding, pulling her forward. She took another step, then another, until solid stone met her feet on the far side. From above, they saw it, a small campfire flickering on a ledge below. Two men sat nearby, rifles propped against a rock. And beside them, wrapped tightly in a blanket, lay a small, motionless shape. Kayla. They had planned this in whispers during the climb. Before leaving, Riven had sent a fast-running boy to Caleb Holt's ranch. Caleb and 3 trusted men would be waiting at the base of the main trail. Briar held a shuttered storm lantern. When Riven gave the signal, she would light it. Riven moved down the rock face, a shadow slipping through moonlight. He was lethal in silence, fluid, precise, born to the dark. Briar watched, hands clenched around the cool metal of the lantern. Riven dropped behind a boulder near the fire, One guard stood, stretching his arms. Riven moved. There was no struggle, only an ending, a soft impact, and the man collapsed. The second guard turned, mouth opening to shout. Too late. Riven was already there, one hand sealing his mouth, an arm locking around his throat. The man went slack. Riven cut through the ropes binding Kayla's wrists and ankles. He helped her to her feet, whispering reassurance. She was terrified, but unharmed. Her spirit held firm, tough as a desert bloom. Riven looked up and gave Briar Holt a sharp, decisive nod. This was her moment. With unsteady hands, she slid open the lantern's shutter. She swung it 3 times in a wide, deliberate arc, the pale light carving a signal into the vast darkness. Moments later, shouts erupted from the trail below. Caleb Holt and his men came charging uphill, raising enough noise to sound like a full posse. Hearing the uproar and realizing they were suddenly exposed, the remaining guards panicked. They fled blindly into the night, abandoning their posts without a backward glance. The rescue was complete. Kyla was safe. Veric Slade had lost his leverage. As they prepared to leave the deserted camp, Riven's boot struck something half buried in the dust. He bent and picked it up, a leather pouch dropped in the chaos. Inside lay the treaty he had been forced to sign. But behind it was another paper, older and more revealing. It was a deed of sale for a mining claim, dated 10 years earlier. The seal was not territorial. It bore the crest of a private railroad consortium based in St. Louis, notorious for ruthless, often illegal land seizures. The listed claimant was Veric Slade. The full picture was not yet clear, but for the first time, Riven held proof of his enemy's deception. For days, the sky had felt unnaturally heavy. The usual dry heat gave way to suffocating humidity that pressed against the skin and turned red dust into a dark, sticky film. When the rain finally broke, it was not gentle. It was violent. Sheets of water slammed into the land, turning dry arroyos into raging brown rivers and the single street of Santo Dedo into a churned pit of mud. For Veric Slade, the storm was an opening. With Riven arrested and the leadership of Stone Wind Camp fractured, Slade drove his men without rest. What had once been a crude diversion at the spring was reinforced, built higher and tighter. Under cover of the downpour, he ordered the final channel sealed. The last trickle of water feeding the canyon vanished. Behind the wall of logs and packed earth, water surged upward, forming a muddy, swelling lake. It was an act born of spite and desperation. Having failed to seize the spring through law or threat, Slade now held it hostage. If the makeshift dam failed under the pressure of flash flooding, a wall of water and debris would tear through the canyon, obliterating Stone Wind Camp before racing onward toward the lower reaches of Santo Dedo itself. Released from his cell but not from his burden, Riven saw the finality of Slade's move. He watched the rising waters swallow the sacred cottonwoods around the spring. This was no longer a legal fight. This was survival. He moved toward the dam through driving rain, every step fueled by grim resolve. Slade stood atop the slick crest like a warped king surveying a temporary kingdom. 2 hired guards lingered nearby, their rifles useless in the downpour. Rain plastered Slade's city coat to his frame, but he didn't seem to notice. Lightning split the sky, illuminating his face, wild, exultant. "It's finished," Slade shouted over thunder and the groan of straining timbers. "The water is mine. The land will follow." "This isn't ownership, it's madness," Riven roared back, his voice cutting through wind and rain. "This won't hold. You'll kill us all, my people and your town." "A calculated risk?" Slade laughed, the sound sharp and unhinged. When this valley floods, the government will declare it uninhabitable for your kind. I'll stay. I'll rebuild. I'll control what comes next." He stepped toward Riven, eyes blazing. Riven didn't retreat. They met at the center of the dam, churning water on one side, a sheer drop into the canyon on the other. It wasn't a clash of fists, but of wills. Creation against destruction. Slade lunged, clumsy on the slick mud, trying to shove Riven over the edge. Riven caught his wrists. They locked together, struggling on the trembling, unstable ground. That was when Marshal Cade Rowan arrived with his deputies. But they weren't alone. Behind them, slogging through mud and rain, came a small, determined force. At its front was Briar Holt, face pale, eyes burning with cold resolve. Beside her stood Caleb Holt, jaw set hard. Behind them followed ranchers and farmers he had rallied, and, unexpectedly, several railroad laborers Briar had once treated during the fever outbreak. They carried no guns, only shovels, axes, and lanterns, the tools of builders, not destroyers. They had seen the rising water. They had heard Briar's desperate warnings. And they understood, at last, that this was no longer just an Apache fight. This was no longer an Apache matter alone. Marshal Cade Rowan pulled his horse hard to a stop. Rain streaming from his hat brim, confusion flickered across his face. He had ridden out, expecting to back Veric Slade, to enforce his bought-and-paid-for version of the law against a single Apache leader. Perhaps a handful of warriors at most. He had not expected to face his own valley. Rowan's gaze jumped from Slade, now flailing like a deranged animal in the mud with Riven, to the hard, unyielding faces of the people he had known all his life. Ranchers, farmers, railroad hands, neighbors. His bluster drained away, leaving the hollow uncertainty at his core. For the first time, he hesitated amid the chaos of shifting loyalties. Then another rider appeared. A lone figure came through the rain on a powerful horse, wearing a long oilskin coat. He was an older man with a neatly kept gray beard and eyes that missed nothing. He rode with a quiet, immovable authority that needed no announcement. He dismounted and strode toward the dam, his gaze taking in everything at once. "Veric Slade," he called, calm but edged with command. Slade glanced up, momentarily distracted from his struggle with Riven. "And who are you supposed to be?" "Arthur Hayes, Territorial Inspector," the man replied, producing a leather wallet and flashing a badge. "I received an urgent telegraph 2 days ago regarding a dispute over this spring. I was also met on the road by a delegation of your citizens carrying a petition." Hayes looked at the dam, then at the documents in Slade's hand. "I've reviewed the preliminary claims. This entire construction is illegal. It is hereby ordered suspended. All titles, maps, and documents are confiscated pending a full federal inquiry." Slade stared at him, mouth open, as if struck by lightning. At that exact moment, the sky answered. A blinding bolt tore downward, not into the dam, but into a towering pine on the canyon rim. The tree exploded in fire and splinters. The ground shuddered. From the heart of the dam came a deep, nauseating groan. A major support beam, already strained, cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. Mud and water burst from a fresh fissure in the dam's face. The legal battle was finished, but the real crisis had reached its peak. "The sluice gate!" Riven shouted, pointing to the iron wheel built into the dam as a last failsafe. "We have to open it, now, or it all comes down." Panic rippled through the crowd like ice in the veins, but Riven's voice, steady, commanding, cut straight through it. Inspector Hayes looked from Riven to Caleb Holt, then gave a sharp nod. "Do it." Riven and Caleb lunged for the wheel. old tensions erased by the urgency of survival. They threw their weight against it, but it was jammed with mud and debris. The dam groaned louder, the sound rising toward a scream. Then the Red Iron outfit men surged forward. Fear gave way to purpose. One by one, they added their strength to the wheel. Briar Holt watched, heart pounding in her throat, hands clenched tight. Then she heard it, a new sound slicing through the storm, a clear, metallic ringing. Down on the tracks, a lone test locomotive sat idle. Its engineer, seeing the lanterns and the chaos at the dam, understood instantly. He pulled the cord again and again, not in rhythm, but in wild urgency. The great brass bell rang out across the valley. Not the crack of gunfire, not a sound of division. A warning bell, a call to unity. With one final, desperate heave, the wheel broke free. The sluice gate screamed open, and a torrent of brown water burst from the side of the dam, bleeding off the crushing pressure. The groaning subsided. The immediate danger, the total collapse, was gone. In the strange quiet that followed, broken only by rain and the distant bell, every eye turned to Veric Slade. He stood alone in the mud, his fine suit destroyed, his face hollow with ruin. His weapon was gone. His authority shattered. Inspector Hayes turned to Marshal Cade Rowan. "Marshal," he said, voice cold as steel, "arrest this man." Rowan, seeing the last chance to save himself, moved with sudden efficiency. He pulled iron manacles from his belt and snapped them onto Slade's wrists. It was finished. Exhausted, soaked, and caked in mud, Apache, ranchers, and railroad workers stood together atop the trembling dam. They had faced the storm and the madness of greed, and survived not as rivals, but as one community. The water Slade had tried to use to divide and destroy now flowed free again, a living testament to their shared strength. The days after the storm became a time of reckoning. Inspector Hayes proved meticulous and unyielding. His survey relied not on convenience, but on chains, transits, and dust-choked maps pulled from territorial archives. Truth measured the old way, and written where it could not be erased. He and his survey crew worked for a full week, pounding wooden stakes into the damp red soil with methodical precision, every measurement careful and impartial. The valley watched in silence. Apache families stood along the canyon rim. Dry Creek folk gathered below on the muddy road. The air felt heavy, laden with generations of conflict and the fragile hope that fairness might finally speak louder than force. When the decision came, it carried the weight of truth. Inspector Hayes called the leaders of both sides together at the base of the dismantled dam. His conclusion was unmistakable. The sacred spring itself, and the land surrounding its source, fell squarely within traditional Apache territory, as defined by treaties older than the town itself. A quiet breath of relief passed through Riven and his people. But Hayes was not finished. He also recognized Santo Deto's genuine need for water and declared that lasting peace required shared responsibility. A new boundary stone was set, a massive block of granite, heavier and more final than any wooden marker. A compromise emerged, shaped by Hayes, Caleb Holt, and a now humbled Riven. The Apache would retain unrestricted access to the springhead, while the outflow, the creek winding through the canyon, would be shared. A schedule was drafted, plain but revolutionary, setting times for Apache gardens and town livestock alike. Water, the ruling stated, was not a possession. It was a trust. The town's reckoning followed swiftly. Marshal Cade Rowan, exposed as a man who sold his badge, was stripped of authority by Inspector Hayes. He boarded the next morning's stagecoach, leaving behind a smaller, bitter version of himself. In his place, Hayes appointed Caleb Holt as acting sheriff until a proper election could be held. The approval from the town was immediate and unanimous. Justice delivered without ceremony. With the law settled, the harder work began: healing. The storm had weakened the canyon banks, and memory of near destruction still cut close. What followed would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. The Red Iron outfit, idle under the investigation of Veric Slade, were offered fair wages from a town fund arranged by Caleb Holt. They came not as conquerors, but as men humbled by unexpected decency. They worked beside ranchers and Apache alike, and it was the Apache who led. Riven directed the effort, teaching them to build check dams not from rigid lumber, but woven willow and carefully placed stone. Barriers meant not to block water, but to slow it, guide it, and respect its path, the way his people had done for generations. Briar Holt watched men who once tried to drag Riven from his horse, now listened to him with quiet respect. She saw a railroad worker offer his canteen to an elderly Apache man. No words passed between them, only a nod. Mud and sweat covered them all. Yet the air felt lighter. They were not just securing the canyon. They were rebuilding something larger, one stone at a time. Amid this shared labor, Briar began her own renewal. The cramped room behind the mercantile became more than a clinic. She cleared space, built rough benches, and fixed a slate to the wall. Mornings became lessons for ranch children, letters and sums scratched in chalk. In the afternoons, she walked into the canyon, where Apache children waited. Kayla stood beside her, no longer only a translator, but a teacher in her own right. The kidnapping had not broken her. It had shaped her. Confidence shone in her eyes, strength in her voice. She moved easily between languages, a living bridge. Briar taught English words for sun and moon. Kyla taught her the Chiricahua words for water and family. Children laughed as two languages blended, and that sound became the valley's new promise. Riven saw it all, his people working with former enemies. The woman he once knew only as a brave outsider, becoming the quiet center of a new community. The children's trust, Kayla's growth. The crack in the wall around his heart widened into a fault line, light spilling through. One late afternoon, when the day's heat finally eased and blue shadows filled the canyon, he found Briar alone in a shallow cave near the spring. It was a calm, sheltered place. Cool stone, murmuring water, and silence that healed. She sat there, turning something over and over in her hands. He stepped into the cave and settled a respectful distance from her. They remained there in an easy, unforced silence. Only the quiet murmur of the spring filled the space. The chaos and strain of the past weeks seemed to fall away, leaving behind something calm and elemental. She lifted her gaze to him. Her gray eyes were steady, unguarded. He realized he had never seen her more beautiful than in that moment. Chalk dust smudged her cheek. Strands of hair had slipped free from their pins. There was a quiet strength about her now, a resilience that glowed softly rather than burned. Slowly, she extended her hand, not in urgency or desire, but with reverence. Her fingers rested on his forearm, directly over the pale, silvery scar. His skin was warm beneath her touch. She felt the faint ridge of old pain, long healed, but never forgotten. She leaned closer. Her voice was low, meant only for him, not a declaration for the world, but a private truth shared between two souls. The Apache chief refused every bride, she whispered. Her eyes held his as her fingers remained on the scar, until one gentle virgin touch broke his sacred vow. The words were the same ones she had spoken in the hostile glare of the market. But here, sheltered by stone and water, they changed. They were no longer defiance. They were understanding. She was not challenging his fear now. She was honoring his past. It was not desire speaking, but trust. Trust grown from shared danger, healing, and choice. A bond that had closed a wound far deeper than flesh. He felt the last of his defenses dissolve. The vow he had carried for years, born of grief and solitude, lost its hold. It was no longer a chain. It was only a memory, finally brought into the light. He lifted his hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Then he leaned forward, closing the space between them. Their first kiss was not fire or hunger. It was quiet, complete. It felt like coming home, as gentle as the rain that had washed the land clean, as cool and steady as the air within the cave. A kiss of gratitude and recognition, a promise spoken without words, two hearts finding shelter in one another. The season turned. Late summer's violent storms gave way to the clear, crisp days of autumn. The sky over Santo Dato deepened into an endless blue. Cottonwood trees along the now peaceful creek flared into brilliant gold. It was a time of harvest, of gathering, of fulfilled promises. Their union was not marked by spectacle. It was as simple and profound as dawn in the canyon. They stood together in a small clearing near the sacred spring, sunlight filtering through leaves. Only those who had helped shape this new world bore witness. Caleb Holt, his acting sheriff's star pinned to a clean shirt. Elra Santos, watching with quiet, paternal pride. And Kayla, standing beside Briar Holt, her presence a living sign of the future they had all defended. Brask, one of the Iron Elders, presided. His weathered face carried the endurance of his people. There were no contracts, no talk of land or law. The ceremony was ancient and spare. Brask spoke in the melodic language of the Apache, weaving their spirits together with words older than memory. He took a single strip of soft white deerskin and wrapped it gently around their joined hands, a visible bond for something already unbreakable. He spoke of willow that bends and stone that endures, of two paths joining, not to erase what came before, but to form a trail strong enough for every season ahead. Riven placed a ring on Briar's finger. It was not metal, but a smooth band carved from dark mountain mahogany, polished until it shone with quiet warmth. Briar did not give him a ring. Instead, she drew out the obsidian arrowhead she carried in a small pouch. Threaded on a thin leather cord, she placed it around his neck. The cool stone rested against his chest, a symbol of his wound, her healing, and a debt of honor transformed into love. It marked the beginning of their story, now bound close to his heart. Days later, they traveled with Caleb Holt to the county seat. In a dusty, sunlit office, before a justice of the peace who regarded them with curiosity and respect, they signed their names into a heavy leather ledger. This second ceremony, so different from the first, mattered just as much. It acknowledged the world they now lived in, a promise to face its laws and customs together, a bridge built not of rope or wood, but of ink and paper, linking the ancient ways of Stone Wind Camp with the growing reach of the territory. In the eyes of the law, Briar Holt became Briar Riven. She wore the wooden ring on her hand, and beneath her dress, on a leather cord, a smaller obsidian arrowhead Riven had carved for her, a twin to his own. The life they built was as sturdy and purposeful as the flood barriers in the canyon. A life shaped by shared work and shared choice. Riven was no longer a solitary leader standing alone against the world. He had become a statesman in truth, a chief who now spoke for the entire valley. The word he used most often was we. Each week he met with Caleb Holt to review irrigation schedules, prepare for winter, and settle the small disputes that are the everyday currency of any living community. He carried a different kind of authority now. It was no longer rooted in vigilance or resistance, but in shared purpose and earned respect. He had learned that the strongest walls were not the ones built around the heart, but the ones raised side by side with neighbors. Briar Holt's life, once defined by movement and searching, finally found its anchor. She was no longer a passerby or a temporary healer. She had become a cornerstone, the small schoolhouse, built from railroad lumber and raised by the hands of both Apache and white settlers, emerged as the true center of the valley. The sound of children chanting their multiplication tables in 2 languages became a new anthem for the land. Briar led naturally. Her strength was quiet but constant. She taught reading and numbers, but she also taught patience, empathy, and the courage to listen. She saw promise in every child, pale-skinned or brown, and guarded that promise with unwavering devotion. Kyla became her most gifted student. Once a victim of cruelty, she grew into a clear, steady voice for her generation. She learned quickly, taught eagerly, and moved between cultures with a grace that translated not only words, but meaning. Guided by Brask, she began recording the old stories of her people, preserving them in written form without stripping them of their spirit. She was the future, honoring the past without being trapped by it, embracing change without surrendering who she was. The scars left by conflict slowly faded, replaced by signs of cooperation. Veric Slade, tried and sentenced to a long prison term, became a cautionary name whispered by elders, a reminder of how greed can poison an entire valley if left unchecked. Fear and suspicion no longer ruled Santo Dedo. In their place grew a careful but genuine sense of shared destiny. Love, family, and collective responsibility proved stronger than the ambition of any single man. One golden afternoon in late autumn, Riven came to the schoolhouse as the day was ending. He stood quietly in the doorway, watching Briar help a young Apache boy and a rancher's daughter wipe down a slate board. They laughed together, heads bent close, their differences erased by a simple shared task. Outside, the remaining children tended the small garden they had planted together. A clever system of wooden troughs and a water wheel carried a steady stream from the creek, fed by the sacred spring. The same water that had once sparked conflict now nourished rows of late-season corn, squash, and beans. Children's laughter carried easily through the clear air. From the direction of the new railway line, a bell rang, clear and resonant, echoing off the canyon walls. It was not an alarm, not a warning. It was the 3 o'clock train announcing its approach and the end of the school day. The children cheered, gathering their things, voices tumbling together in English and Chiricahua. Briar stepped out onto the porch beside Riven, tired but deeply content. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the children scatter home, watching the life they had built, richer and more complex than either had once imagined. The last light of the sun set the canyon aflame in gold and fire. Riven wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart, a cadence now as familiar and necessary as her own breath. "The old vow is broken," he said softly, his voice low against her ear. "So we could keep a new one, to protect each other, and to protect this water." She looked up at him, then out across the peaceful valley. The spring flowed freely, feeding gardens, sustaining the town, giving life to all. And she knew that this vow, forged in fire and sealed by trust, was the most sacred one of all. "Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso Legal/Disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting, as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.